they'll auction some off and that sort of thing. But in general, I think it's a tax on energy where even if you were going, say the worst predictions are right, and on our current trajectory, Miami's going to be underwater. Any of the cap and trade proposals, they would only barely reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So maybe, some of the higher parts of Miami would not be above underwater. I mean, it wouldn't have a noticeable impact. So to get very specific on this, I think that any policy that tries to curb greenhouse gas entitlement to slow its increase, there's no demonstrated, nobody can argue that that will prevent any of these horrible things that, by the way, nobody's saying we think these horrible things are going to happen. They're saying they might happen. So I just wanted to answer very specific.
Yeah, I'll do just briefly on cap and trade. So cap and trade is borrowed from what George Bush Sr. pushed in the Clean Air Act in 1990. So there were tradable credits. And it's a very market-based way for government to step in. And it was a reaction to, I think, some well-taken critics of earlier government approaches to command and control regulation, where government just told you do this or do that. The idea of cap and trade is, if it costs me $50 to reduce the emissions and it costs him $5 to reduce the emissions, we can make a trade so we get the efficient reduction and at the margin. And so when you looked at the 1990 Clean Air Act after it was implemented, and you looked at the industry estimates of cost at the time it happened, where the lobbyists were saying it's going to cost zillions of dollars, it came in, based on a Wall Street Journal story I used to hand out to my students, at less than 10% of those costs when they measured it about 6 years later. So the market-based, but within a property trading rights that actually addresses the problem, is what the administration has been proposing. And we saw it work well in the Clean Air Act. Now, is there some messy politics in Washington about getting it passed? Heck yeah. Some states, including Ohio, get hit harder. And the way that it works in our political system is then you end up making deals where Ohio gets a little something extra because they're otherwise going to get hit because of coal and things like that.
Other questions? Yes?
I just have a question about how much you guys feel, whether or not it's the politicization, making a political issue of the environment, or more so the involvement of politics affecting environmental policy. For example, what I'm thinking of is going back to the 60s and 70s, or even before then, you saw that environmental law and environmental regulations wasn't necessarily an issue that was in the political realm. It was more so divorce of politics, where all individuals agreed to some extent that things needed to happen. But at that point, since that point, things have become more politicized, whereas if you are more left-leaning, you're going to be more environmentally friendly, and according to some perspectives, some people. And the Republican Party tends to be more anti-environmental regulations and controls. Does that have an effect on environmental?
Yeah, I mean, Washington messes everything up. It drives me crazy when I have conservative friends who will say, oh, we should pave the rainforest. It's like, no, just because some liberal policies about the environment are bad doesn't mean trees are bad. And I'm a Catholic, and I believe we have a moral obligation to take care of God's creation, and even outside of a religious view, you have a moral obligation to, take care of what people after you are going to inherit. You don't litter, you don't ruin the planet. So there's a degree to which, and then on the left, one of the negative sides of this politicization is that I think there's this immediate jump of environmentalists who say, okay, what can government do? How can we create a new government program or regulation to solve this problem? And too infrequently do they say, all right, what can individuals acting privately do through volunteer work? Or the question that Ronald Reagan asked about everything, including the environment, what government policies can we remove? How can we reduce government interference in a way that will fix this environmental problem? So I do agree, there's been a politicization which has made conservatives stupidly not care about the environment, and liberals stupidly jump towards government solutions when looking at environmental problems.
Just a history of politicization. So the Environmental Protection Agency came about in the early 1970s when Edmund Muskie was, this was in 72, when Muskie looked like the mayor, or 71 when he looked like he was going to be challenging Nixon for re-election. And Muskie was big on the environmental stuff. And then Richard Nixon ended up supporting EPA so that he could take the issue away from Muskie. Now, there was no lack of politics in the world of Richard Nixon, right? I mean, this is the politicization gone wild. This is sending plumbers into the Watergate and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think there's some Eden kind of previous world where we didn't have politics. I think we're in a democracy. We've had politics for a long time. We're going to keep having politics. Some politics is really slimy and greasy. I grew up in the city, Albany, New York, where the same mayor got in 1940 and he died in office in 1984. He died a multimillionaire. You know, how do you do that? He was a public servant. So like, I'm not thinking everybody who's a politician is beautiful. We have a long history of screwed up politics and politicians. The question is, when you have really complicated coordination problems, such as air across the United States or global things, can you do it through volunteer efforts and actually have something happen? I don't think that's likely to be a path to actually have something happen.
Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned the British report where it says the difference in the time it takes to GDP and the actual cost of implement. Looking at the prison insurance, what about someone like Your Lumber who takes a very different approach and says, you know, the cost to implement these things and have the money be diverted from other better ways to go about addressing global poverty and other issues? How does that square with kind of more global pressure?
I'm not an expert. The person you quoted, if I have this right, I bet Tim knows the facts better than I do, had been on that side of the argument, and he, within the last year or so, actually switched back to say we have to take action on climate. So that's...
Yeah, no, Bjorn Lomborg has been on 3 different sides of the fence. But the point, I just want to elaborate the point that you're repeating that he made, which is, again, climate changing, the planet getting warmer. I'm granting premises that I don't necessarily agree with, but the planet getting warmer isn't itself a bad thing. What could be a bad thing is if it becomes arid in regions where they like to farm, or it becomes flooded in regions where people live. Those are bad things. So why are they bad? Because then people end up homeless, or people end up without food, or people end up without a way to make money. So again, part of adapting is our money spent better trying to predict, trying to reduce, if we can measure it, greenhouse gas emissions, predict what the climate will be and change it slightly, or is our money better spent doing other things to help people farming in a different part of the world? That's one of the ways you could look at it. If you start from the premise of that we know where climate change is headed, and B, that government should be taking some action, one of the answers is, okay, our action should be helping people adapt and feeding poor people, even separate from the question of adaptation.
Other questions? Yes.
Mr. Carney, you mentioned that you would prefer countries, I guess, to invest in adapting to climate change as opposed to preventing climate change. I was wondering, how do you go about doing that when the effects of climate change are so unpredictable?
That's a really good question. First thing is, if sea level rise is one of the things that gets cited the most. And let me start here on a free market reform. The government subsidizes, if you ever see those really nice beach houses, like on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, I was just on Maryland and Delaware on the coast they have, the government subsidizes the insurance that those people buy. So when hurricanes come in and knock those down and they get rebuilt, I'm paying for that, even though I definitely don't have a beach house. So the first thing would be to stop having the government subsidize either living near or building near shorelines. And in the U.S., there's all sorts of things we do with rivers where we dam them up and we try to control the flow. Environmentalists don't like it because it destroys wetlands, but farmers like it because it creates predictability. So there are things to do for that. But the other aspect of it is simply wealthier people if a society is wealthier, it can adapt better. These things I'm talking about not living on the banks of the river, that doesn't help, poor boat people in Southeast Asia, people who live actually on boats. Helping other countries get wealthier, helping them develop an economy, that's the best way to allow them to adapt. If my house got flooded again, I could move. I'd be in a bad shape, but I could move and I could be okay. I know people who could, let me sleep in their basement. In a poorer country, that's not as easy. So the number one way to aid adaptation is to not get in the way of economic development. The number one way to get in the way of economic development is to make energy more expensive.
All right, we'll go to our next question. Yes.
It seems like you're both saying greenhouse gases either are or could potentially be bad. And on the one hand, you're saying, but the cost of doing something about it is prohibitive, and you're saying, well, the cost is high, but we can afford it. The thing that I'm surprised that was only mentioned one time, it was mumbled, is we have a clean, responsible, readily available alternative right now that emits no greenhouse gas, which is nuclear, and neither of you is standing up here advocating nuclear energy or spending your time promoting it.
Well, you know, the Obama administration has supported shifting more towards nuclear power, which surprises a lot of people, given the long-time environmentalists. So you know, the administration's taking positions that some of the traditional left constituencies really hate, and in favor of trying to see how much there's a nuclear option.
And nuclear option.
Sorry, nuclear electricity power, non-greenhouse gas option.
I actually believe that we're going to come up with better solutions, especially if the government stops picking winners. Nuclear is tricky. I mean, I don't know if you could build a nuclear power plant without the government basically protecting you from the liability of what happens if it melts down. And so that would be another subsidized source of energy. And maybe we want to do that. France seems to have done that well, but I just read an environmental website, GRIST, saying no, France really hasn't done that well. That's a bit overstated. So I'm open to all options. I think the thing that would best dictate what's our best way out, because we're going to get off of petroleum. Coal is another answer. We've got a lot of that. It's great. I always say that's a sign that God loves America. Of course, what does the oil mean about the Middle East? I don't know. God hasn't been that nice otherwise in that part of the world. But yeah, I'm open to nuclear. I'm open to all sorts of options, but I think people in Washington trying to decide what the right way out. That's silly. The Obama administration have been pretty good in that while they've picked winners and losers, they've picked a lot of winners at least. They've tried to. So I'll praise them for not just getting on, you know, a windmill bandwagon and having that be the only way out.
Other questions? Yes.
I just had a question about the cost of implementing policy. I feel like climate change is different than clean water or clean air. And in clean water, we're cleaning up rivers here in this country for our kids, cleaning up the air in our cities for our kids in the future. Climate change is a global problem. And so to take the insurance analogy, I guess, it's almost like the United States is a duplex, and you're going to have to convince the other people there to also buy the insurance. And if you can't, then at that point, does it become impractical, A, with the cost of, you know, negotiating deals, or even, you know, knowing that you're never going to reach a worldwide agreement, does it just become a political issue at that point?
Yeah, I think for me that's a question that I'm most puzzled about. Is there some way to make a difference globally so that it's worth, you know, moving forward? And so we have this in other environmental areas. So acid rain was basically air products from one part of the United States that drifted east over the northeastern part of the United States where the acid rain came down. And it was very hard politically to get the upwind states to agree to limit their stuff for the benefit of the downwind states. But we have this supremacy clause in the Constitution. We have Congress, and eventually over time, they were able to come up with a way to do acid rain that addressed the problem. So I think there's a question. So you might come to the view it's so hard to get international cooperation that we're just stuck with things the way they are, and we don't want to be the suckers who spend money when no one else is. And then we should just start investing right now in mitigation. Just start building the seawalls. That's not a crazy position, but I don't think that people who see the skepticism are saying we should then start building the seawalls, or we should start doing, you know, all the animals who are going to become extinct in their current habitat, we should start moving them north and all this kind of stuff. So in a lot of times, you see a problem, you're not sure you can solve it, and then you say, you know, if not me, who, if not now, when, and you decide you move forward. And maybe you're a sucker for trying to solve a problem. That's a possibility, but not solving the problem is going to lead to a world that probably will be pretty lousy.
That was too rhetorically well crafted to for me to let that be the final word.